All right, hello everybody. Welcome to week 12, the last week of material for this course. This week we will be discussing gender selective political violence and criminal dissident terrorism. These are both kind of fairly new classifications of terrorist environments, so you may not have heard much about them. Prior to this, they were always included in other classifications. So here we are, week 12. We're still discussing definitions of terrorism. All right, so gender selective political violence is the use of violence against specifically either males or females of a particular group. There's a long history of selective violence against different genders. Before this kind of extra new kind of classification of it, specific violence against the different genders was often considered just an unfortunate consequence of war. But it's more than that, I think. So if you're talking about violence against men, some of the common rationales for why that occurs are that they're trying to eliminate enemy fighters, eliminate enemy soldiers. They massacre existing soldiers or fighters that have been captured, trying to destroy a particular patriarchal culture. Essentially, killing men is trying to eliminate enemies, right? And trying to eliminate the people that are fighting you. So if you want to eliminate the chance to revolt or an uprising, you have to eliminate men, and groups often did. Common rationales for violence against women are more this broad cultural repression of women and girls to make them submit to their roles that they're supposed to fill. They'll take enemy females as kind of these quote-unquote spoils of war. And also like symbolically destroying the cultural chastity of an enemy group, through this mass rape. So violence against men is almost always to eliminate potential adversaries. But the repression and violence against women is, so it's different, right? The repression of women, even if it's culturally based, does not always result in terrorist violence against women, right? Again, definitions. Okay, because in some societies, women have more rigorous cultural restrictions placed on them that regulates their behavior and dress, their ability to be independent from men, their access to basic services, their quality of education and employment. Some societies have that all the time. Okay, and they're often enforced by law, but sometimes it spills over and gets enforced by violence, right? And this is where these distinctions, start getting made. Repression of women is bad, but is it always terrorism? Here we get into definitions again. Other times, restrictions are enforced more unofficially, either tribally, family, clan customs, right? Those things are often unofficially enforced, but are just as repressive on women, as these ones that are enforced by law. All right, so there's 3 different case and point sections related to this that compare different types of repression. Okay, so read each of those and think about them, in relation to terrorism. Are they all terrorism? Or some of them terrorism? Is just one of them terrorism? Okay, so read those and think about, what's going on and how that relates to terrorism. All right, so like every other kind of terrorism, women can be classified as state terrorism or dissident terrorism. Again, state terrorism is supported by government. Okay, so when you talk about terrorism against women at the state level, it's usually from campaigns of conquest during a war, or when there's the state identifies this overriding threat to their authority from an indigenous, ethno-national, or religious group, essentially an uprising. Okay, so again, they list some examples of this in the book. Dissident terrorism against women is conducted by bands of insurgents, different groups, paramilitary groups, okay, not necessarily state sponsored. And these oftentimes happen during events. Okay, they often happen in the middle of kind of these larger type events. So a lot of times when these things happen, they're kind of hidden um, by these kind of broader things that are going on. They get overshadowed, and it may not be as readily visible to people. These could be things like ethnic cleansing campaigns, removing enemies from particular territories. Right in the middle of all that, there's a specific violence against women that's going on that doesn't necessarily get the attention that this larger kind of overriding kind of event is doing. So, how do you respond to these types of events, or how should they be responded to? Um, I'm sure you all have heard about the genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia, and in those cases, they used international tribunals to try those cases. People were convicted of war crimes related to rape and sexual violence committed against women in both places, both Rwanda and Bosnia. There's also private groups, private international agencies who investigate, report, and document gender-selective political violence. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, um, other groups like Doctors Without Borders. All of those groups do this, and there's been uh, an increase, I guess, in the identification of these type of events, um, and the world is starting to pay much more attention uh, to what's going on out there, as opposed to just, well, that's just kind of what happens when you have a war. Um, they're starting to get attention on their own, which is good. All right, criminal dissident terrorism. Uh, so international organized crime has increased, and there's a lot of reasons for it, but over the last couple decades, kind of this international view of organized crime uh, has increased. So, but with that, you have different types of organizations, right? Some organizations are not very sophisticated at all, but others are, really pretty sophisticated and have formed kind of these international criminal cartels. Um, so, criminal organizations um, have participated in terrorist activity, but they're either profit motivated or politically motivated. But remember, we're talking about crime organizations. So the main goal of international criminal cartels is profit, right? They're wanting to make money. Okay? So you have these groups that participate in violence. Then you also have groups sometimes that join forces with terrorist groups. So you have these criminal enterprises uh, that will join forces with terrorist groups. Why do they do that? Well, because it's mutually beneficial to them. Okay, so both types of groups, terrorist groups and criminal groups, they're secretive, they're covert, they're antisocial groups. Oftentimes they're underground, right? They're already very similar, uh, structurally at least, pretty similar. So if you're a terrorist group, you need resources, right? So by making a deal or joining forces with this criminal international cartel, you can take advantage of their black market smuggling operations to get the resources you need, or use them for other things. Because international cartel can get you what you need, right? They have the pipelines already. They know how to do things. So it could be a mutually beneficial uh, relationship. All right. So traditional criminal enterprises, profits overriding goal, and they only become political in order to secure the safety for their operations, right? They don't want necessarily to destroy a system. Um, they just want to manipulate it to their benefit. Okay, and if it's up to them, they probably wouldn't even want to really do or participate in violence, and they don't generally unless governments are actively targeting the group or actively trying to eliminate the group. Okay, so when we're talking about traditional kind of criminal enterprise, you're talking about things like the triads, the yakuza, drug cartels, mafia, right? Those kind of traditional kind of criminal enterprises. But when you get into this criminal political enterprises, they're a little bit different. Okay, so you have these dissident terrorist organizations, and they become involved in these transnational crimes because they have necessity, because they got to have the resources. So they have to use illicit markets to get what they need. if you're a terrorist group, would you rather be able to get the stuff you need on your own, or would you rather have state sponsorship where you have to do what the state says and you know, you're at risk at least some. If the state decides they don't want you around anymore, the state would have the ability to get rid of you. Okay, but if you can get everything you need on your own, you can pretty much do whatever you want. Don't have to rely on any kind of state sponsorship. All right, so that's kind of the real quick, what the differences are between those. The remainder of the chapter is just dedicated to different examples of groups participating in criminal dissident terrorism, different cartels. So I'm not going to sit here and just talk about each of these individual groups because to do that would take an extraordinary amount of time. So I'm going to stop here with the video. But be sure you read all that. Make sure you familiarize yourself with those groups and what they do. And please let me know if you have any questions.